Look, the floods, the politics and the climate change idiocy is next level at the moment. I showed you yesterday the absolutely astonishing comments from the Prime Minister when he visited the New South Wales flood zone. It pains me that our national leader could speak such illogical, embarrassing nonsense. But here it is again.
We are looking at long-term solutions. My government has changed Australia's position on climate change from day one.
Does your head in, doesn't it? Can you imagine talking to people who have lost their homes under floodwaters again, who need help, who need to be either settled somewhere away from the floodplain or protected by a flood mitigation dam that's been talked about by politicians for 3 decades? And the Prime Minister turns up and responds with that? The way he's going to deal with the real world problem of severe flooding is he's going to keep cutting Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. 1.2% of global emissions they are, and falling. And he's going to cut them more quickly. And even though global emissions are still rising, this is going to stop floods happening? It's just insultingly silly. Even though floods have happened here forever and will happen forever in the future, and even though the worst floods that have been seen in this particular area happened before anyone had invented the internal combustion engine and before there was any coal-fired electricity in Australia. I mean, you have to despair, don't you? But it's not just Anthony Albanese. Listen to his minister earlier this week.
I don't think that we can pretend that we aren't seeing more of these events because of climate change. I mean, if we need evidence that climate change is here, all we've got to do is look out the window in places like Sydney, the Illawarra and the Hunter right now, or those bushfire areas that we saw. I mean, I think the fact that we are seeing these kinds of natural disasters happen at such a scale, so frequently in so many different parts of the country, is a sign that things are changing. And that's why we need to change. It's why we need to take serious action about climate change so that we don't see the scale of these events increase even further.
Really? You see a flood and that proves global warming. What happens when you look out the window and it's a nice day? Does that prove anything? So what, when people looked out of their windows and saw the worst flood in Windsor back in 1867, were they looking at global warming? And no one has to pretend anything, least of all pretending all this is getting worse. We know that fits your narrative, but the records are the records. And we know floods have been worse. We know there is no evidence to suggest these floods have been made more severe by climate change. Listen to the experts.
There are people who will say that this is evidence of climate change, but there isn't a great deal of evidence for that. But that doesn't mean there's no climate change signal in these events. It's just that the scientists can't show that there's a climate change signal.
Right, so it could actually be climate change, we just can't say it with certainty, is that right?
Well, there actually isn't any evidence of its climate change. It's not a question of certainty. These weather events do occur naturally.
Yet we have politicians pretending the evidence is clear, that this is all about climate change. And much worse, so much worse than that, they then pretend that their policies can make a difference. Seriously, this is what passes for political debate, for public policy debate in our country now? No wonder we're in strife. Our politicians don't care for the facts or for the science, they care only for the emotive rhetoric. And tragically, most of the media goes along with this lunacy. Have a look at this editorial in the Sydney Morning Herald today. It actually lauds Anthony Albanese for making this ridiculous statement.
We are looking at long-term solutions. My government has changed Australia's position on climate change from day one. For example, what we know is that Australia has always been subject of floods, of bushfires, but we know that the science told us that if we continued to not take action globally on climate change, then these events, extreme weather events, would be more often and more intense. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that play out.
Talk about inanity. in public debate. Not only do we have a Prime Minister making these nonsensical pronouncements that Australian policy can change the weather, can change us from a land of droughts and flooding rains into some kind of thermostatically controlled nirvana, but we have major media organisations joining in this fantasy. That Sydney Morning Herald editorial said it was important that Albanese has called this spade a spade because it opens up the way for a real debate on how Australia and New South Wales should respond to the world we face. Really? Calling a spade? He has ignored the historical flood record, made up a pop version of climate science, and then pretended that building wind farms in Australia will alter the global climate, even while China is building more coal-fired power stations. It's just silly. But the Herald endorses it. The paper says that as well as dealing with flood issues, Australia must move quickly to cut carbon emissions by more than the 43% target by 2030, which Albanese will formally legislate this year. Yes, indeed, that'll do it. Make our power even more expensive and unreliable. That'll fix the floods. I guess that way, the next time the Hawkesbury floods, we might not hear about it. Remember, this distortion of public debate has real consequences. This determination to place climate change rhetoric and ideology above the science and the facts and reality is the very reason we've seen dumb decisions made by politicians in the past. It is why New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria and Queensland have all spent billions of dollars building desalination plants that they have never needed and which they now spend millions of dollars on every week to keep in working order just in case Tim Flannery's permanent drought eventually turns up. And the climate rhetoric is also part of the reason politicians have spent 3 decades considering the raising of the dam wall at Warragamba, but never bothering to actually build it, a move that would have turned it into a massive flood mitigation dam and would have reduced the disastrous floods of the past 18 months to nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Instead, faced with the type of natural disasters this country has always faced and always will face, we have a government that plans to get rid of these floods and our bushfires and droughts too through their climate change policies. If you believe that, you really need to introduce yourself to reality. But this is the madness so much of our politics and media has become deeply invested in. It's going to take some tough years before they wake up.